Yeah, so this talk is about converting end UI tests to a contract test wherever possible. So this is an issue that we came across here at Findmypast. A few end-to-end system-wide tests that were UI driven, and they were flaky, and they were testing a sad path, so like an error condition, just a lot of maintenance. And we wanted to reduce the amount of maintenance and time that we spent on this, and especially because we use a single CI server that like everyone in the engineering team uses. If anything goes wrong, it's blocked, it blocks everyone. So we wanted to reduce instances of that happening as well. And the solution is to take some of these tests and convert them to a contract test, and I'll explain what that means in a bit. So this slide is someone else's slide, but it illustrates the testing pyramid very well. It also shows different versions of the testing pyramid. So on the left side over here, ice cream cone shape of the testing pyramid. You have this vague idea, like there's manual tests. So someone will be, say, like an integration environment, going through some critical paths like sign up and register manually to test that everything is okay. We have automated GUI tests, so like with Selenium or Phantom.js or something like that. We have integration tests, and these could be, for example, application-specific integration tests, so it's not end-to-end, testing different services. And then we have unit tests at the very bottom, and those are just testing like a specific unit, a module or a class or something. It's what's being under test is not extending outside of those boundaries. It's not testing a different class or anything outside of that module. And the shape implies that, the ice cream cone shape implies that most of the tests are manual tests, and then we have a lot of automated GUI tests, and then less integration tests, and we have the least unit tests. And there's different shapes of the testing pyramid as well. Sometimes you see an hourglass shape, so you might have a lot of manual tests at the top, and then like maybe you have less integration tests, but then you also have a lot of unit tests at the very bottom. The shape that most people want to achieve is the pyramid shape. So it's like basically the inverted ice cream cone shape. Right? Nice observation. So the idea here is that you want to push to the top of the pyramid the tests that require a lot of maintenance, that are very slow, and that are very flaky. And here we'll have manual session-based testing at the top, automated GUI tests below that. Then we have automated API tests, and this is where contract testing comes in. Below that, we have automated integration tests, automated component tests, and automated unit tests. All right, so how can we take basically something that's in this section, automated GUI tests, and move it down a layer to automated API tests? So we're going to use something called consumer-driven contract testing. This is, I guess, a bit of a trend that is suggested that engineering teams adopt, especially if you have a microservice architecture, because in such an architecture, you're making a lot of API calls, and it's possible that the provider of that API, if something changes, then that can break a bunch of consumers of that API. And consumer-driven contract testing tries to solve that problem. The consumer would define a contract for the API, and it's saying like, this is how I use that API endpoint. And then the consumer can run that contract test before releasing a change to make sure that nothing is broken. So as in the API call actually still works. And the provider can also run those contract tests to make sure that when they release a change, nothing is broken, so that they don't break the API for any of the consumers. All right, so we have a tooling team here at Findmypast. I'm not sure what their actual team name is, but they created an open source tool called Jackal, and they wrote a blog post about it, which I won't go into detail here. But if you want to read it, it's on tech.findmypast.com, and it's called.
Just gonna jump in there.
Yeah.
It was a ring fence team that built Jackal. Sash, Neil, and Donald. That's it. So they were ring fence for.
Okay, so like a temporary team.
Yeah, temporary team.
Okay.
We learn Sash. Other people learn the development.
Yeah. Okay, so correction, not the tooling team. Sash, Neil, and Donald created Jackal. Please read our blog post, it's very good.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'll show you the actual use case. So we had this test here at the bottom. So this is a Selenium test written in Gherkin style. So we have a scenario. It's a sad path. So user already registered cannot be registered again. And the user would register, and then we test that there's an error message displayed. And this test was completely justified when it was added, because we didn't use contract testing at the time, and it was something that we felt was important enough to test. Then Jackal was introduced, and this was a perfect use case to move that test down further in the testing pyramid. So I'll have a quick look here at the README for Jackal. And Jackal, it's a microservice itself, so it runs on a server. And there's also an NPM client provided, which has a command line interface. And with that, you can run your contract tests. And the idea is that once a consumer specifies contract tests, then you would use Jackal in your CI as a build step. So like maybe after you run unit tests, then you run Jackal contract tests as well before you actually release the changes. And Jackal works by having either a YAML file as shown here or a JSON file where you specify the contract. And at the very top level, you start with the consumer name. And this would typically be the name of the application where the contract test lives. Then you have the provider name. This is the name of the provider of that API. You name the API endpoint. This doesn't strictly have to match the API endpoint name, but it would be good if it does. And you have a scenario name, which could be whatever you want to call your scenario. In this case, it's an OK 200 status. And below that, you specify the request of the contract, so specify the response. And here, where we mostly care about like the shape of the response and the types. So like, are we getting certain fields that we expect? Are we getting them in the correct type? Like, are they an integer or a string? And if you want to be more specific, you can also test specifically the values of those fields, but you don't have to. And we also test the status code over here. All right, so now I will show you, if I can navigate to it, the actual test that was added to replace this UI test. So the consumer here is a Titan API. Titan is a new application we have here at Findmypast, and it's kind of like the front-end application to all of our microservices. So Titan API is the consumer of the account API. So account is one of the microservices that we use where users can register accounts. And the endpoint is to register accounts. So in this case, this is an example where the endpoint doesn't strictly match the endpoint in the account service because the endpoint is actually /account. So it would be, I'm trying to make like a readable test here, and it would be less readable if this said account. So now it says account register account. And the scenario that we're testing is that someone is already registered with that email address and want to make sure that there's an error response. So Jackal supports before and after hooks. Let's have a look at those. So why would you want before and after hook? You want to have your contract test, like make it as idempotent as much as possible. So leave it in a state as it was before you ran the contract test. So in this case, we want a before hook because if we're testing the error case that someone is already registered with that email address, we need to register a user with an email address before we do the second request where we try and register someone again. So that's what the before hook is for. And I won't go into details of how that's structured, but there's a request and you specify the body and the response as well. And here are some variables specified because we can capture a state of that response and then bring it over to the next hook, for example, either the after hook or the actual request that we're going to make later. So I'll take a look at the after hook now. We have an after hook because when we do create a user in the before hook, we want to also basically delete that user so that the microservice that we're testing the API of is in a state that it was in before we ran a contract test. So that's what the after hook does. It does some cleanup. And then here we have the actual request that would be ran. So we specify the URL, the path, the HTTP method, the post in this case, any headers. So the API is expecting JSON. And here we specify the body of the request. So we specify the first name, last name, email address. And here you can see that variable that we specified earlier is being used here. So we make sure that we register a user with the same email address. We specify password, confirm password, and so on. I'll minimize that. And now the response, this is where we do some assertion. And I'll back up a bit here and simplify this. So one thing that Jackal will check is that the status code is 400. Mm-hmm. And you can also, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I have something stuck on. Yeah. You can also do assertions on body. So typically you want to have as loose of an assertion as much as possible when you start out. So you'll say like, just return an object. And once you get that to pass, you want to make it more specific. So once you have that passing, then you can do something like this. So it'll be an object that contains an errors field, and that will be an array of objects. And that, like one of those objects would have a field called field, and that should be a joy string. Sorry about joy, it should just be a string. And it should also have an errors field. And in this case, we're checking that it's a string, but also specifically that that string is email address in use. So that's basically how a contract test looks like from the consumer standpoint. And below that are just some other scenarios that we won't be looking at in this demo. So let's run that and see how it goes. Just some changes to the URLs because it wasn't the actual URL. So now we can run it. So Jackal has a send command, and this tells Jackal, the service, to run the tests for a specific contract, and you specify the file path for which contract test to run. Because there's multiple scenarios, it's going to run all of them, so register account, unmatched passwords, and so on. There we go. Okay, so Jackal, it requests to the service, to the endpoints that we specified in that contract file, to match the specifications that we stated, and if they do, then the test passes. That this is the one that we looked at. Sorry, the top one. User is already registered, and that is pretty much the demo.
So how fast are those to run? Like you say, they run really fast, don't they?
How fast are the contract tests to run?
Contract tests as opposed to the UI tests and unit tests and everything.
Yeah, so they're quicker to run than a UI test because there's no like UI navigation. So there's no like user loads up the home page and then they go to a form and they start typing in information. Even if it's automated, it's still quite slow to go through all those steps. And often with UI tests is like, say you have different flows that you want to test that have to do with registration, those steps would be repeated. So you would go through the same registration steps for each of those UI tests. And that's quite slow. What this does instead is it skips a lot of those UI steps, like the entering, clicking on buttons, entering forms and that kind of stuff. This is just testing the APIs. It is doing an actual network request though. So it's not as quick as like say something where you mock it like a unit test or something. But it is a lot quicker than the UI test.
For me, they seem like basically their API test. It's test your own API, right, and make sure that you're delivering what everyone expects, which is great. But I don't really see how these are an alternative to end-to-end tests. And an end-to-end test doesn't just test whether or not the API is in the state expected. An end-to-end test exercises the JavaScript on the page. It exercises the HTML. It exercises more than just what's going on back
That's right. Yeah.
I can see a point where, in case where you've got 3 UI tests and they all do the registrations, that's incredibly frustrating. It needs to be done 3 times. I just don't see how this mitigates that.
Yeah. So to be clear, this is not a 100% replacement for UI tests. You still want to have UI tests, but your UI tests should be as little as possible. So you want to be testing with UI tests like critical business paths and happy paths as well. So like user registers and it's successful. But anything that's like less critical for the business, so use it like an error case. User tries to register with an error. That's something you want to push lower down into the pyramid.
Yeah.
And you still want to get confidence that it works. So in this case, we could, for example, have this API test where we're checking that the microservice that does the account registration returns a correct error response. And then inside Titan, we could also have another integration test or even a unit test that says, given this mocked response, then we expect the UI to, or the controller, whatever, to generate this flash error message or something like that. So it doesn't have to be pushed all the way to the top as a UI test.
Yeah.
And you can still get that same confidence that it works.
Sure.
Going back to the sample, there is the contract test that you shown as an example. Can you show that again? Your Jackal test.
Any specific part?
The response one. The response. Okay, there you are asserting on the error email address in use already, but for the field you are using any string. Could you also have done like a specific field?
Yeah, I could have. Yeah.
No, we actually did the code review for this, but I didn't.
Yeah, so it depends how strict you want the test to be, and because making it stricter also makes it more flaky and more brittle. It depends if the consumer is actually, if it cares about the value of that field or not. If the consumer only cares about the error message, so email address in use, and that's enough to pass on like to the localization or whatever to produce that flash error message, and this is specifically the thing we should be strict about. If the consumer doesn't necessarily care what the field is, as long as it that's how, so try not to make it too strict in areas that don't matter as much. You'll see a lot of contract tests that are less strict than this. They mostly care about just the shape of the response and the types. So they don't care about the values at all. And if they can get away with that with the same amount of confidence that we can make changes and it won't break anything, then that's good to do. But if you want to be more confident, then be more specific.
For me, I can see you have other scenarios that are matching password, NTO missing fields. These, I don't know the details about this case, but again, it seems like we're breaking the pyramid, no? Because, for example, spaces in the password, I'm assuming you're going to have some JavaScript checking for spaces in the password. So why are you even creating an API test?
Yeah, so that's a good question. When I did a Git pull, these scenarios were added. I don't know the reasoning behind them. So, but yeah, for edge cases like this, you don't necessarily want it to be higher up as an integrate contract test because it's doing actual network requests. So if these can be pushed down lower the pyramid, you would want to do that.
Well, there we are. All of those, I think, are covered in React unit tests. I'm not sure whether it's just a requirement just in case the React fails or something and it does hit the API requirements.
It's possible that the consumer treats these different scenarios as different errors, like on the UI or something. I'm not really sure. But if they're all treated in a generic way, then it's not something we want to contract test every edge case of.
Plus, our app might not be anything that consumes that input. Although this is inside of Titan, I guess.
This is consumer.
Yeah, there's a bit of Jackal there. Right now, nothing else is consuming it.
But like, I think the important thing here is that it's the consumer, like you said, that cares about the shape. So
That's right.
like for instance, the API could be giving a property that nobody's using, a property name to something else, but because no one's using it, that doesn't break any contracts.
Yeah, so this is a pretty important point I should have mentioned. It's of consumer-driven contract testing is that the providers don't release any breaking changes. But I didn't go into detail, as in if they want to make a change to the API endpoints, they either they never remove anything from the response, so they always append extra information. So that's a non-breaking change for the consumer. Or they define a new version, so like in the header or in the URL, like a new version for that API, wild with what the new response looks like, or what, you know, or they can also create a new endpoint with the same API version number. So either like you always append something to the existing API endpoint, or create a new API endpoint, or just create a new API version where you go wild. It ensures that there's never any breaking changes introduced to an existing API endpoint.
But from a consumer perspective.
From a consumer's perspective.
So like release breaking change, right? That doesn't break anything because no one's consuming that key.
It's from the consumers.
That's what I'm like. Does this provide that? Like
If you take away a property that someone's using,
yeah,
first you need to ask them whether or not.
This, no, I don't think you, because like tennis is here is a certain, that's one thing, no? But that API could be returning other stuff, but from this point of view, it doesn't break.
exactly. Like the way Jackal works is it's a central server, and both sides communicate to Jackal to a server, right? If it changes a property that exists as a breaking change, right? And it goes up, but then it finds out nobody's using that property, right? It's not a break. Then, you know, in a way.
Yeah, so the provider could, before releasing that breaking change, could find out if it would be a breaking change. It can tell Jackal, please run all contract tests provided by consumers, something like that, or for my service. And if there's no errors from that change, it doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't introduced a breaking change. It just means that you might be lacking a test for this API endpoint from the consumer's perspective. So if the consumers are well tested, then the provider should be able to ask Jackal to tests for my service to make sure that this change doesn't break any of the consumers.
The reason I bring that up is just because you mentioned about the stricter you become to tests, the more flaky they are. But the point of contract tests is like it has to be super strict. So, like, where do you draw the line on that? And like that's one scenario that is a questionable scenario. Like, if you want to, like, if you say as soon as I release this, i.e., there's documentation as well saying that this key exists, then and you release that to the public, but no one consumes it, there should either be a test there, right? Or it's, you can change it. And then it's like, you know, do you know what I'm saying? Like, because
So I think I get the point that like they're kind of have to be strict to prevent breaking changes. They can be brittle, but I would argue that it's more of a different approach in like how the team addresses testing. So it's a good practice to not introduce breaking changes to an API anyway. Like you should have a versioned API or do append only. That like those are things we should be doing anyway. This kind of catches you making those mistakes. So yeah, your test would fail if you did that stuff, but they should be failing anyway in those cases, I think.
interesting. That scenario is an interesting one. Because if you're relying on Jackal to tell you from the API for that property.
Yeah, so if that's an
go straight through.
that is an issue,
Yeah.
and I guess more tests.
I think that comes down to like as owning the project, right?
Yeah.
They know that if they change the property, it's a broken chain. You just be that strict. Jump down.
Yeah. If the consumer identifies that as a risk, like if they don't test this and it could have severe consequences, then they should probably test that as a contract test. The responsibility of every consumer, which could be like different teams working on different apps. It's up to those consumers to identify what are the risky areas and should I be testing those.
If I find the Jackal sort of syntax or whatever it is, this JSON really, but it's weird because it's the same as Mocha or any sort of RSpec type framework. You have to write it in JSON.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like we just use Mocha and then just run that almost. I mean, you could have Mocha and this Joy library working together, and then instead of having to like write a parser for every variation.
Yeah.
I believe this Jack was built on top of some work by some BBC open source project. So I don't know the detail. It'd be better to ask like Sash, Neil, or Donald about that.
Yeah.
But
Just change it.
Yeah, stick Mocha.
That's what we call it. Jackal is an open source and feel free to open issues and improvements.
Yeah, and shout out again to the people working on it, Neil, Sash, and Donald. They've been really responsive to feedback that we've given them, and they're quick to make improvements to it.
We've got a Slack channel, no? Right? We've got the Slack.
Yeah, if you work at Findmypast, there's an internal Slack channel called Jackal that you can go to.
Okay.
How did you find, like, as you wrote these tests, right? How did you find writing it? That, like, in terms of like, if you.
Did you have joy?
Yeah. Did you enjoy it? Did you find it satisfactory? Like, if, as I was saying, like you have to write it in this very particular shape compared to say the free
lost connection to the OnLive Hangout.
No,
Nice collapse tool. Very good expand collapse.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that kind of makes it. I need to ask if they got that.
What do you mean?
Right, the collapse.
You can collapse
Line
the box.
77 has been collapsed.
Yeah, man, that's like a default behavior.
No, it's not. It's not.
What in?
Is that us?
Is that Atom? It's default
Yeah,
behavior.
most editors will have that behavior. But as to how the experience was.
I'm telling you, I don't have it.
I think you just haven't done it and then on. Yeah, come on.
So
Oh, good.
when I started writing it in YAML because I thought like that makes it more readable for the user. But I quickly found that writing it in YAML was worse because in these contract tests, you really, in the assertions, you also care about the shape of the response. And you see it's a lot more explicit when you use JSON, what the shape looks like. In YAML, you don't necessarily have like the opening array bracket or the opening object bracket. Like it's there's some abstraction happening in YAML. And here I get to see a lot more what that actual request and response looks like.
Yeah.
So I think like I prefer writing them in JSON. And in, I guess any other things that like how the experience was is there were some issues in the beginning in V1 of Jackal where if the test failed, there wouldn't be much information about why. So it kind of swallow up the response and the error, and we just tell you that something didn't work. But they made a lot of improvements around that. So now if it does fail, it tells you, it gives you the response, it gives you the status code, all that kind of stuff. So it's a lot better now than it was before. And so far it's been a pretty good experience, I think.
Okay. Cool. I don't think.
Nothing more. And you have any for next brown bag session? If you are doing something interesting in Titan, or even like I didn't present anything in Titan, I just talk about my application.
It's great.
You can come and share with people.
I'll talk about my other apps as well.
You can talk about your apps, your books, your everything. Great. Okay.
Nice
Thank
one.
you very much.
Good work.
See you.
Thank you, guys.
See you soon.